We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order.
Coming up this week,
Britain is under attack by the world's two worst entities, rape gangs and bond market speculators. As Starmer mounts a last stand, we're reporting from the tattered remains of old Blighty. Is Musk just messing with Starmer's tiny mind, or are the Americans serious about sinking HMS Britannia?
Meanwhile, just as the world is thirsting for AI, the Biden regime has decided it will titrate the market for the specialized NVIDIA graphics chips that are vital to building AI systems. It's like sanctions, but for everyone else in the world. So will this make America more friends?
Finally, we're revisiting a multipolarity tinfoil hat classic, Trussification, the process of targeted financial dynamiting of a political regime. As Biden squeezes the oil market, is he looking to leave a tightly coiled inflation turd on the desk of his successor?
But first,
It needs Musk.
well, we knew that the transition period from the Biden administration to the Trump administration was going to be eventful. I didn't think we'd see Elon Musk seemingly trying to collapse Britain politically, which is kind of what's happening. And I don't think that's really an exaggeration. I'm sure listeners know exactly what I'm talking about. This is not a hidden news story. Elon Musk has gone on Twitter and massively promoted the grooming gang scandal that has lain dormant in British politics, widely known but dormant, for many years. The first thing to say is Elon Musk has definitively proved that he is able to push a news story into the public consciousness, just to give loads of things swill around on Twitter or whatever, and like no one pays attention outside of Twitter people. But just to give an example, a Sky News host today said that the child grooming gang scandal in the United Kingdom is the greatest in modern British history. I think that's actually probably true, by the way, on its face. I don't mean in the moral sense, it's an absolutely awful thing, but I mean in terms of the impact that this is going to have on British society, I think that's pretty much an accurate statement. So the whole thing's gone viral, I suppose, in Britain. It's what everyone's talking about. I mean, we'll talk about the economic situation in Britain too in a moment. There's a confluence of bad things happening at the moment. But even with all these economic problems and so on, everyone's focused on this child grooming gang scandal, and it seems to have like set off a kind of a meme cascade online about kind of like general pedophilia, child abuse, all this awful stuff. Kind of reminds me of the 90s in Ireland when the child abuse scandals in the Catholic Church broke. The scandals that are being talked about in Britain are, in my opinion, far worse than what happened in the Catholic Church. But, you know, you have the same kind of vibe. And I think the best way to describe that vibe is a hollowing out of the credibility of the institution that the accusations are targeted at. Again, to go back to the Irish Catholic Church example, by the end of the pedophilia scandal in the Catholic Church, the credibility of the Catholic Church in Ireland had been effectively completely hollowed out. And even to this day, Catholic priests in Ireland kind of, you know, the first time they get up on stage to talk about anything, they apologize for the child abuse scandal. And that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's not far off. It's one thing when a scandal like this is targeted at a civil society organization like the Catholic Church. The grooming gang scandal is targeted at the British government and the British state. It's also targeted at the current Prime Minister, who was head of prosecutions, head of Crown Prosecution Service, at the time of when some of the scandals were taking place. So it was ultimately his decision on whether or not to prosecute many of these cases. And I think the accusation is one or two of the cases was prosecuted, but many of them weren't. So, but what I'm trying to get at here is that this looks like a fairly concerted attack at various layers of the British government, going from the Prime Minister's office to Parliament, who presumably didn't oversee this properly, and then right down to kind of the police, the courts, the entire state apparatus, in a sense. And I mean, I really can't believe what I'm seeing. I never really thought I'd see something like this, but I don't know exactly. Maybe we can speculate about it shortly what Elon Musk's intentions are. I think on its face, people would say, oh, well, he just wants to attack Starmer because he doesn't like him and he wants to promote reform because he's currently promoting a bunch of right wing parties in Europe. But I don't, I mean, this goes a lot further than that. As I said, it's not just an attack on a prime minister or anything like that. It's shaking the credibility of the British state right to its core. Just very quickly before I hand it over to you, Andrew, the other issue is that the sterling is in free fall. I mean, not quite in free fall, but it is falling quite rapidly on the back of the fact that a bond crisis has just kind of emerged in Britain. I mean, we always expected it would. The trigger here is a little vague, to be honest. It could be due to very large bond issuances because the government's borrowing so much, and I think that's part of it. Part of it is probably the strengthening of the dollar and some speculation that inflation might come back due to rising energy prices. We're covering that in a later segment of the show. But suffice to say, foreign bondholders are spitting the dummy, as the Americans say. So, look, the most negative interpretation of what's going on in Britain right now is the state and the economy are disintegrating. I hope that is an over exaggerated reading and it's just going through some incredibly large amount of turmoil, the likes of which I don't think I've ever seen before. But, the extreme interpretation might not be wrong here. We'll have to see where the economic situation goes in the next few months and whether the Trump administration really are ganging up to wreck Britain or whether Elon Musk is just applying some pressure on a government he doesn't like.
There are two discrete stories here, I think it's fair to say. The first one is the Musk-driven re-emergence of the grooming gang scandal. And the second is the increasingly serious economic problems that Britain faces at the moment. Let's take the Musk-driven re-emergence of the grooming gang scandal first, as you did, Philip. Listeners will remember, back in October last year, we said that the Labour Party was picking a fight with both Elon Musk and Donald Trump, and that if Trump won the election, it could end up being disastrous for them. And it was a massively stupid thing for them to do, and it suggested that they didn't think and that they had a sort of adolescent mindset. Adolescents sometimes do things because they believe they're entitled to it or they should do it or they're morally obliged to do it. And well, why should I have to deal with consequences? We all know how adolescents often think. And we said at the time that the Labour Party was acting with a kind of adolescent mindset and it was a really foolish thing to do because if Trump won the election, it would lead to trouble. And what's happened? Trump's won the election. So during the election, during the US election, I should say here, the Labour Party had sent both strategists to talk to leading Kamala Harris strategists about how they had rebranded the Labour Party in Britain and how they had managed to gain a massive majority in the UK Parliament by doing that. They also sent hundreds of individual kind of foot soldiers, if you like, to go across to the US and campaign and door knock and canvass for the Harris campaign. All right. That infuriated the Trump campaign a fair bit. But in addition to that, Matt Taibbi broke a report in the middle of October last year, which showed that an NGO called the Center for Combating Digital Hate, which was co-founded by Morgan McSweeney, who is Keir Starmer's kind of eminence grise, if you like. For American listeners, he's the equivalent of the chief of staff to the president of the US. That's kind of Morgan McSweeney's position to Keir Starmer. So this NGO had been co-founded by Morgan McSweeney, and in fact still, I believe to this day, or certainly shares an office with Labour Together, which is Morgan McSweeney's kind of party within a party, if you like, kind of like the Tea Party in the US to the Republican Party. Labour together is to the Labour Party, only even more organised and even more influential because they took over the entire Labour Party. They were using black hat social media tactics and lawfare to try to, quote, destroy Elon Musk's Twitter. Like, Taibbi got his hands on leaked documents, and destroy Elon Musk's Twitter was consistently top of their, grid for what they had to do. And Musk responded to that. This means war. All right. So they can hardly be, surprised now that they tried to, or they did offer help to try to defeat Donald Trump, who was Musk's kind of political paramour, if you like. And at the same time, they tried to destroy one of Elon Musk's businesses, which he paid billions for and which he bought because he believed in a specific cause. They tried to destroy him and that business. And now they're acting surprised that Musk is kind of fighting back. Now, I don't mean to say that Elon Musk is a amazing political operator or anything like that. But compared to the Labour Party, he's kind of Otto von Bismarck. He's Clemens Metternich. He's intellectually so far superior to them that even with very little seasoning, and even given the fact that he kind of shoots from the hip and instinctively, he just consistently outmaneuvers, the Labour Party and the broader British elite, because the Labour Party leadership and the broader British elite are of such poor quality. Look at what Musk has done. He was worried about free speech. So he bought a platform that was very influential in politics. He gutted the organization of all the people who enforced the kind of, quote, woke mindset, the woke mind virus, as Musk calls it, or political progressivism, and used it to silence right-wing conservative voices. And then he used that platform to support a politician who, if he got into power, could then protect that kind of free speech platform. And then he used that platform and helped that politician get in. I mean, this is like quite impressive stuff. This is maneuvering, which is kind of similar of quality to the engineering of catching a rocket that's falling from space, right? Like, he's just intellectually so far superior to the Labour Party leadership and the broader British elite that, as I say, even without political experience or seasoning, he is outmaneuvering them. And it's really been a big thing, because the grooming scandal in Britain, there should be no mistake, it was a horrendous scandal. It was difficult to think of anything that could have been more outrageous, more shocking, more repulsive, and more disgraceful. I mean, literally tens and perhaps hundreds of thousands of young girls, and actually the most vulnerable, girls who came from bad backgrounds, who had, at a very young age, had addiction problems, who were in social care because they were so vulnerable. It was those, the most vulnerable of our daughters, who were preyed on by organized gangs of men who would essentially prostitute these girls. They would torture them. They would sexually abuse them. They would prostitute them. And it was, and in this, they were kind of facilitated, if not deliberately, then perhaps by indifference, by the authorities, by the police, by social care services, and even by local politicians. It's really quite appalling. And in fact, although there was some coverage of this in the British press, that coverage was quite minimal. In fact, if you looked, George Floyd, the death of George Floyd, the death of a habitual criminal at the hands of the police, however unfairly, in a foreign country, got more coverage than the mass organized rape, prostitution, and torture of tens of thousands of vulnerable British girls. That shows you where it was in the press. This was something that was waiting to burst out, and Labour has been so poor since they've come in power. They've been beset by error after error. They've stumbled from one catastrophe to the next. It was just like shooting fish in a barrel for Musk. And finally, after firing a few shots and landing a few blows, he's found the big one. And this has just exploded back to the surface. And it's become a huge issue, and rightly so. The other issue, of course, is the economy. And I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that, Philip, as the podcast's resident economist, because I think this is very important. It seems that at the moment, Inflation isn't quite under control. Inflation looks as if it's kind of starting to maybe tick up a little bit. And at the same time, the pound is declining and bonds are declining in price or increasing in yield, depending on which way you want to put that. And that doesn't really make for a good environment for a central bank to lower interest rates. Ordinarily, in that environment, you would expect a central bank to, at the very least, keep interest rates on hold, but maybe raise them a little bit. The problem with that at the moment is the economy itself, after the Rachel Reeves budget, is screaming out for lower interest rates. So the Bank of England's kind of in a little bit of a bind. And meantime, a report came out the other day that said that Rachel Reeves herself, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the British equivalent of Finance Minister or Secretary for the Treasury. So Rachel Reeves said she's like completely depressed at the moment because she knows the economy's in such a bad state that she hasn't got any good choices. Like all her choices are very bad and are going to be very unpopular and are going to make her look like a fool for the things that she's previously said. So it really doesn't look good at all. Like the economy looks in a bad state. The kind of money / financial / banking / bond markets seem to be extremely fragile or at least vulnerable at the moment. And meantime, you know, Elon Musk has just hit a kind of setback alight, this huge political scandal, this kind of outrage that sinks its roots into every single part of the British state almost. And it seems to be openly looking to bring down these guys. I mean, he said in October, this means war. And it certainly looks as if that's the way it is at the moment, with the first ethnic violence in Britain that I can remember, or in the UK outside Northern Ireland, at the same time as the economy is not doing very well, as the government is tremendously unpopular. Taking aim like this, bringing up such a political scandal, would seem like an effective way to pursue such a war.
I agree with what you say on Musk running rings around these guys. I suppose I'm surprised by that insofar as the people involved on the other side, who are making, as you say, error after error, who are interfering in American elections, who are going after American companies, usually not thought to be a great idea in general, given the power of the US state, especially over Western countries. They don't seem able to calculate the blowback from their actions. And I really don't understand that. You've said it's like a teenage mindset. I agree, it is totally like a teenage mindset. But how do people with that kind of a mindset rise to positions of power in a political system? I thought...
Well, it's the same way that like a 4th division football club can win the league because they're playing against other 4th division football clubs. Right, they're not playing against Barcelona and Manchester City and Real Madrid and AC Milan. They're playing against Rushden and Diamonds and York City and Dagenham and Redbridge. And so they rise to the top of the league, right? But if they get promoted or if they end up playing, you know, like Newcastle United or Aston Villa one game, they get thrashed, right? That's how it works.
Yeah, true. I mean, I guess one step back from that is why do we have 4th division teams running a country of whatever, 70, 78 million people? These are not sophisticated political players at any level. They seem extremely arrogant as well in their way that they approach America. It's almost like they want to be part of American politics and partake in it, but they don't want any of the downside of partaking in it. And yeah, it's a very strange thing. I guess the real question or mystery is basically whether this isn't the United States finally tossing Britain in the trash. And I say that because, you know, Musk could fire off on Twitter. He could hit a sore spot. And the powers that be in America or, you know, the sophisticated people in diplomatic circles or whoever deals with this kind of stuff could say, okay, ooh, that's getting a bit much. He's really going to unravel parts of the British state, in effect. So give him a tap on the shoulder and tell him to chill out a bit. I don't think anyone's told Elon Musk to chill out a bit. You know, I think domestically he's going to be relatively diplomatic with the incoming Trump administration. If the big guy told him to shut it off, I think he probably shut it off. So the actual mystery is, why hasn't anyone told Elon Musk to stop? And the really, you know, the extreme interpretation of that, which, look, it's not just mine, this is what's bouncing around at the moment in political circles, is whether this might be the United States finally saying, okay, we're done with Britain. I think a lot of the economic life has already been sucked, in a sense, out of Britain. A lot of the talent that the Americans want, tech talent mainly, some finance talent, is pretty easily sucked over to America anyway, more so tech talent than finance talent. We've covered loads of this stuff on the show before, of relisting stocks that used to be on the London Stock Exchange. They're being pulled over to Wall Street now and so on. So there seems to be kind of a pipeline in place for the Americans to suck the resources that are worthwhile, because there's no physical resources. It's human capital. It's pretty much just human capital, really. Intangibles for the most part. And then there's the end of the Ukraine war. Britain were kind of point man on the Ukraine war. I don't think that's a secret. Boris Johnson was the one who kind of went over and told Zelensky to, to go ahead with it. I think we've said on the show before, I don't think it's a secret that probably you and I both think that the Americans were always going to pin the war on Britain if they lost the war. So I wonder if a confluence of those factors is driving a deeper move to decouple from Britain behind the scenes. And I wonder whether, I'm not saying it was planned and like Musk was put up to it, but I wonder whether Musk didn't just kind of, trip on this. And then in normal times, somebody would have kind of tapped him on the shoulder, or would have tapped Trump on the shoulder and would have said, okay, that's enough. They're scared now. They won't try and, wreck your Twitter anymore or whatever. They won't try and wreck your business anymore. Tone it down. And just nobody's tapping anyone on the shoulder because they're like, oh, yeah, well, we were kind of going to, saw that branch off anyway. I wonder if that interpretation is true. I mean, that really is, I don't want to say the end of Britain, but it's the end of the British business model and diplomatic model that has lasted since at least the Thatcher and maybe 1945. The City of London model, which is kind of an offshoot of Wall Street, it piggybacks on the US dollar hegemony as the kind of minor player, very minor player in that, makes a bit of money from it, and so on. And then on the diplomatic side, we won't go into British and American joint diplomacy, but it was in the EU for a while. It's not in the EU. That's actually annoyed the Americans a lot. Ukraine, Britain played a large role in Ukraine. It's played a large role in Central and Eastern Europe, and so on. And I'm wondering if all that now is just being wound back. It would fit. All the pieces fit. So we'll have to see. We have to watch whether this continues, and we definitely have to watch whether, when Trump gets in, the relations between Trump administration itself and the Starmer administration or ministry are as bad as they look. Well, I'll just leave it with this. Starmer has not been invited to Trump's inauguration, so they're off to a very bad start. I don't think they understand that the world has changed. It's not 2016 anymore. Mark Zuckerberg's getting behind Trump. Industry is aligning with Trump. One of my friends just got back from America and he said it's not 2016, that's Trump country now. And that is how it feels. And I think they haven't got the software update on that one. So definitely one to watch. Will Britain survive 2025?
I just want to make a very brief point before we move on about that, because even if you're not correct that Team Trump has decided to jettison Britain for whatever reason, I think you might end up being right, actually. And the reason that I say that is because Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, himself was a human rights lawyer, a very senior human rights lawyer. And he surrounded himself with people like Philippe Sands, like Jonathan Powell, who are really very major figures in the world of international law, of human rights, of internationalism and international cooperation. This idea that the world ought to be organized in a way that, follows the judgments of the international courts, that works through the United Nations, that strictly adheres to treaty obligations, where human rights is a central part of diplomacy, where states ought to try and act in the most moralistic way as possible. All of these people are kind of really quite major figures in that field of thought, in that theory of governance. And they finally reached the pinnacle of UK politics. These people who are kind of true believers have reached serious positions of influence on the political side rather than the bureaucratic side. just at the moment when the United States is finally saying, no, enough of all of that. We're going to make policies in our own national interest. And you can see it, like even under Biden, they were doing that. But even more so under Trump, it's going to be at least even more naked, even more bald under Trump, this move toward national self-interest rather than internationalism and human rights and international law and treaty obligations and all of that kind of stuff. So that's simply naturally going to clash with the kind of the British government position as run by these Labour guys. And you're 100% right in saying that people like Philippe I mean, Keir Starmer is a kind of dull as dishwater, legal background bureaucrat and not a very effective one at that. He's not super sharp. But people like Jonathan Powell, or I'm sure he would probably say Jonathan Poole, that's how he'd pronounce it, to give you an idea of the character. And Philippe Sands are pretty intelligent people and don't hide it at all. And they're almost guaranteed, these people, to rub the Trump guys up the wrong way. You can see them saying, well, actually, old boy, I think you'll find that per international law, you've got it all wrong. And you're using the wrong fork for your grits. I mean, it'll be that kind of thing, that the same kind of thing that John Maynard Keynes rubbed the Americans up the wrong way when he went begging for money. You can imagine it being the same thing. I would say, though, that there's a paradox at the heart of what's happening. And the paradox is this. In Europe, at least, the elites, the current incumbents, the establishment political parties are the most likely to be Atlanticists. They are the ones who want to suborn European national interests to US security and strategic interests. They're the ones who want to maintain close links with the US. On the other hand, the populists and the nationalists are the ones who want an autonomous European policy. They want European countries to make policy in their own interest. It's people like Viktor Orban. It's people like Robert Fico in Slovakia. It's people like Marine Le Pen in France. These people, to varying degrees, all want Europe to have an autonomous foreign policy. And yet, they're the ones that the Trump administration is likely to feel naturally inclined to get along with. And certainly they're the ones that people like Elon Musk and at the other end of the scale, Steve Bannon, are going to push. So there's a paradox there between probably Trump's national security team and Trump's kind of like media supporters like Musk. And I think that'll be extremely interesting to follow. Chip off the block. There's a huge story. I mean, regular listeners to Multipolarity will know that for the last 2 years, we have been following the US effort and ultimately failure to hobble China's access to certain high-tech sources of economic growth, and especially through restricting Chinese access to some of the higher-end chips. First through Huawei, the mobile phone and telecommunications company, but more recently under Joe Biden, under the Biden administration, the entire Chinese economy has been prevented from buying chips. Now the ultimate step has been taken. The final boss of these chip sanctions has arrived on the scene in the dying throes of the Biden administration, and they've really laid the big one down. What they're going to do is they've realized, or they believe, that artificial intelligence and the development of artificial intelligence for various things, from apps and software as a service and SAP applications and customer service applications, all the way up to artificial general intelligence, kind of running the world as a godlike, super intelligent entity. They believe that this is going to be the future of 21st century technology. And right now, to run the training runs that artificial intelligence learns on, you need to buy masses of chips that were traditionally used for creating graphics for computers and especially computer games. You buy a whole bunch of these chips. It gives you tremendous computing power, and you use that computing power to put AI programs, AI software in these training runs. You get it to play a Googleplex of chess games against itself, and hey presto, it's like a chess player with an ELO rating of 4,000 and can crush the best chess players in the world in like 25 moves. That's how it works. So what the US is going to do is it's going to restrict access to these GPUs, most prominently made by NVIDIA. As we all know, NVIDIA's share price has gone through the roof in the last 3 or 4 years because it provides these GPUs and they're seen as a big growth area for the future. So the US is going to restrict access to this, not to China, not to Russia, but essentially to the entire world, right? It's going to split the world into 3 tiers. Now, tier 1 includes the US, it includes Canada, it includes Great Britain, France, Germany, and 1 or 2 other countries. That tier 1 is going to have unrestricted access to GPUs. So, thank you, Uncle Sam. We can buy as many GPUs as we want, and we are allowed to develop AI. Tier 3, which includes, unsurprisingly, China and also Russia and a few other countries. Tier 3 gets no access whatsoever. None. It's banned from buying these GPUs from NVIDIA and AMD and 1 or 2 other companies. So they're not allowed to develop AI or anything that might use these GPUs, like data centers, for example. That's off the menu for them. They're not allowed to do it, in theory. The most interesting tier, though, is tier 2, where basically you're allowed to get some GPUs, but only a few. And if you want to get more, you have to apply for a special license to the US to get these GPUs. And the US has said that it will take into account trade policy and human rights records when getting these licenses. And one assumes whatever concessions the US thinks it can extract. This tier 2 includes India, it includes Portugal, it includes Poland, it includes the United Arab Emirates. These are countries that might have thought of themselves as US allies, but they are now going to have to apply to the US and beg and offer concessions in other areas in order to get enough GPUs to run these training programs for artificial intelligence. So that's what they're going to do. They're going to essentially restrict the entire world access to NVIDIA's GPUs. And if you want an exception, you're going to have to apply to the US and beg them and kind of offer them other goodies. Now, I guess there's 2 possible outcomes to this, Philip. The Congress has been quite clear about it. The senior Democrat and Republican in the House of Representatives on the China Committee wrote a letter to the White House saying that it's a great time. The US has got a bit of an advantage on these chips. It's got a bit of an advantage on AI. So by taking very strong steps like this, what it could do is it could both keep that advantage by restricting the rest of the world's access, but also drag countries into the US strategic orbit by extracting concessions in exchange for giving them access to this technology. They're very open about it. So I guess there are 2 outcomes to this. Either it works. That's option 1. So it works. The US advantage is cemented. China can't catch up. China is left, constantly 5, maybe 10 years behind in artificial intelligence. And that's important because it's an industry that moves quickly and it gives the US economy a constant competitive advantage over China. And at the same time, other countries are slowly dragged into the US orbit by having to offer concessions in order to get access to this technology. And everyone lives happily ever after. The countries are rich. The US economy has this constant advantage, and the US sphere of influence expands because of their control of the access to this crucial technology. That's option number 1. Option number 2 is it completely backfires. What it'll do is it'll force China to develop its own equivalent of the NVIDIA chips. That will create a new competitor for US businesses who suddenly will face competition in the market. And at the same time, companies will get the whole rest of the world because they'll offer their tech for free while the US is restricting access to their tech. So while the US gets probably Europe, Japan, and Australia and Canada, China will get the rest of the world. Chinese companies, because of that, will become much more competitive, and eventually they will damage US companies. And that's certainly what Oracle and NVIDIA seem to be saying. In press releases, they have really strongly criticized this move. But Philip Pilkington, what do you think? Option 1, great success. Option 2, total backfire.
Well, I just mentioned very briefly that back in late September, the South China Morning Post reported that Huawei claimed that they were sending out competitor chips to NVIDIA, to some manufacturers in China. I don't know if it's true or not. I think the Chinese are usually pretty upfront with their technical capacities. I don't actually understand what makes GPUs hard to produce. I understand what makes the advanced semiconductors that require the advanced lithography systems difficult to make. It's because the capital machinery is so delicate, the lithography machines. It's not really clear to me what makes GPUs difficult to make. Maybe something does, and America has a speciality in it. I don't know. I'm not an expert. And Huawei are saying that they effectively have a replacement for this already. That might fit with the interpretation that GPUs actually don't have the challenges to make them that the semiconductors that we often talk about, the very small 3 nanometer or whatever semiconductors, which definitely have very tight constraints on making them and are very difficult to innovate. I mean, I just again register some skepticism about this whole AI phenomenon. I think I've done it once on the show before. But let me take it from a slightly different perspective this time. What if the whole AI boom is happening and all the hype is occurring because America have an advantage in GPU manufacturing? GPUs are graphics cards. Computer game nerds will know that you need an NVIDIA GPU to run the latest Fallout game or whatever, right? That's what they were designed, as far as I understand it, to initially do. They were gamer chips. And gaming nerds would always be chasing the latest graphics card so that they could play the latest graphics game. Game designers were obsessed with them, etc. I don't know the history of how they all ended up being made in America. Probably had a lot to do with the gaming industry. Then it subsequently became clear that the same technology was used for AI. And I wondered, and I've wondered for some time, whether the entire AI boom itself might not just be hype around the graphics card industry. I don't know. But here's what I will say. It's not a tangible at the moment. AI is, at best, in its beginning stages. It is not like the semiconductors, where when they placed the ban on them, I think it was started in the Trump administration, Huawei literally could not make smartphones for a couple of years. Advanced smartphones, I mean, market competitors with the iPhone. And you saw their revenue dip quite substantially, and people were asking, would they survive? That's all changed now because China have their own domestic chips, the Kirin 9000S, I think is the name of it. But for a few years there, they couldn't make iPhone competitive handsets. So there was a very tangible result. You remove the chip, Huawei takes a big revenue hit, and then you see the dynamic effects where it self-undermines the sanction itself because they develop their own tech. If you take these graphics cards away, assuming that China can't just create them themselves, which Huawei are claiming they can, but let's say that they're not telling the truth, nothing happens. Nothing actually happens because this technology isn't actually in anything yet. It is speculative technology. And all it's really used for are if you ever use AI to try and do research. Frankly, I'm completely unimpressed with AI. And people tell me it'll get better and all that. Maybe. But that's all it really does. The last thing I'd say about it is why I'm so skeptical of AI technology in general. And the reason is because the first industry, or at least one of the first industries, to experiment with AI technology was quantitative finance. So it's about 10 years ago. I worked at a quantitative finance firm, quite a well-known one. And the guys, the quants upstairs, physicists, econometricians, all these guys, got their hands on the AI technology. And I used to talk to them about it. And trust me, if they can use that stuff for pattern recognition, and it works, it genuinely works, then a finance quant should be able to squeeze a ton of money, or alpha, as they call, out of that technology. because a lot of, quant finance is just stitching together patterns in the market, regular patterns, and then trading those patterns. And I won't go into the details of what ended up being produced, but it wasn't much. And after a couple of years, people got bored with the technology and stopped talking about it. If anyone's really interested, it was mainly used for word searches in 10K statements of companies to try and predict futures revenue shortfall. And I think it worked to some extent. But the point is, it didn't change the game in finance. And if there's one place where pattern recognition technology should have changed the game, it was in quant finance. So I remain very skeptical of technology. But even if I'm wrong about that, even if I'm an old codger and I don't want to recognize the new thing, even if I'm wrong about the fact that maybe this is all hype to sell graphics cards, there's no tangible thing that happens after these sanctions. It's not like the semiconductor sanctions where instantly Huawei can't make phones that can compete with the iPhone until they develop the Kirin 9000S and can make their own phones. So nothing will actually happen here, except maybe one thing. And that's NVIDIA's revenues will fall because they won't be able to sell these chips to certain companies. And what will happen when their revenue falls? They won't have enough for R&D. And they won't be able to keep things going. And the federal government will not subsidize them because they've just gone through a whole mess with IBM, which is going broke and taking money from the CHIPS Act and so on. So the subsidies aren't going to come. So they'll probably damage NVIDIA's revenue, and that'll probably damage their R&D department and their long-term growth going forward.
Trust the plan.
So listeners to the show will know that I occasionally put on a tinfoil hat and peddle a conspiracy theory where dark evil forces within the Democratic Party and the finance industry, maybe in the civil service as well, are planning to hobble the Trump administration by financially squeezing them. I've referred to this as the trussing or trussification of the Trump regime in memoriam of Liz Truss's short-lived government, whom this sort of happened to. We won't go back into that. I think we have a previous episode. Go back and listen to it to hear what actually happened to Truss and how it's relevant. We may be starting to see the first moves on that. And let me be clear here. There isn't some game plan out on a whiteboard somewhere, like with everything connected. Now, this will be, if it happens, a large amount of political force exercised to try and talk down the economy and to try and, I'm going to say it, damage the economy while Trump is in power, specifically related to bond yields, inflation, and the capacity of the federal government to finance itself, which ultimately means for the trade deficit. We won't go into that now. And that's what this is going to look like. It'll be a ratchet up pressure, and it'll be people opportunistically taking advantage of news that comes up, events that come up, and so on, to try and put maximum pressure on a budget that's been completely blown out by the Biden administration. That's basically what's happened. The Biden administration leaves Trump with a giant mess. And then, every time that mess starts to kind of start creeping through the cracks in the walls, there'll be like people sounding off a foghorn going, everything's collapsing, and trying to put pressure on markets. Okay, well, I think we're seeing the first move in that regard. The Biden administration, on their way out, because they seem to want to do loads of big, really controversial policies on their way out, and the media doesn't seem to want to criticize them because there's something wrong with the media. They have slapped on what are supposedly the harshest sanctions on Russian oil tankers, or their so-called shadow fleet, which just means that they're not insured out of London and they're insured from elsewhere. They're putting the harshest sanctions on them that have been put on so far. Oil prices are responding. I think they're up to $79 a barrel now. Bond markets are starting to price in that the central bank won't lower rates, and this is already putting upward pressure on bond yields. It is actually part of the story of why Britain is experiencing a mini currency crisis at the time of recording. There are a few things here. The first thing is, fundamentally, this strategy of economic warfare is clearly real. There is absolutely no one who thinks that they're going to bankrupt the Russians by doing these sanctions anymore. The oil price will go up and Russia will get more oil revenue. We've seen this movie before. And even though these people bang their head against the wall with the Russian sanctions and so on, I don't think there's anyone out there who says this is going to finally overthrow the Putin regime or destroy the economy. No, it'll probably just give them more revenue, right? So this is being done as targeted at the Trump administration. That is almost certain at this stage. And so what we can say is this technique of political warfare is going to be a thing for the next few years. It's gone beyond just simple news stories now, kind of vaguely talking down the economy, raising issues. Will they have a trust moment? All this stuff that we saw last year. It's gone beyond that now. And there are concrete measures being taken to damage the American economy when Trump is at the helm. Very, very cynical. And I mean, you really have to question where our country is when its politicians, even opposition party politicians, try and damage their own country just to get at a political leader that they don't want. Final thing I'd say is, will it work? Will this specific one work? Will it put pressure on inflation? Will it constrict the oil supply? Well, I don't know, because it's very, very hard to tell how these things will work or whether they will work or not. I think there are two possibilities here. One is, this is the ace card that was held up the sleeve. Biden never put this thing in place before because he didn't want to damage the economy when he was president and when Kamala Harris was running for president. He didn't want more inflation. He didn't want Federal Reserve interest rate hikes or no cuts or whatever would result from it. And so he held back. And on that interpretation, he's played the ace. And this will actually be very disruptive. It won't shut down global oil markets. It won't even stop Russia exporting the oil, but it could create, 6 months of severe turmoil in global oil markets, which is enough to really get up the nose of the Trump administration and put an awful lot of pressure on them. The other interpretation is that this won't do anything, that it's been just hyped up by the Biden administration as a way to kind of spook markets at the very end of the tenure and create a little bit of difficulty on the way in, and that nobody really believes this will work anyway. I think this actually might fit with the fact that news articles are now reporting that the inflation is due to the sanctions. And that is new. We used to not talk about that in polite company, shall we say. And now they're reporting on it. So somebody is definitely pushing the little button that exists on the back of these journalists, apparently, and is saying, you are now allowed to report on that. But, that could also be part of the interpretation one. We don't know. We'll have to watch where the oil price goes in the next 3, 4, 5 months. But yeah, Biden's definitely trying to push a red button here. And it looks to me like economic warfare is going to be a real aspect in the Trump administration.
I don't doubt that will happen. It's certainly a playbook that's been used extensively by the European Union, which we've covered on this podcast, and which former guest and journalist Thomas Fazzi has covered extensively for Unheard and his Substack. But can I offer a more innocent, or certainly less wantonly nefarious explanation for this? I'm sure listeners will remember the tremendously popular political soap opera The West Wing. And there's an episode in The West Wing, pretty much toward the end of the run of the show. It's in the second Bartlett administration, toward the end. So he can't run again. They've only got a certain amount of time left in the White House. And Leo McGarry, the former chief of staff of President Bartlett, comes back from his heart attack. And he is kind of suddenly, from being central to everything that happened, become a kind of an old man to be kind of looked at fondly and humoured rather than listened to and treated with a great deal of respect. But eventually he gets them all to listen to him, and he gets on a whiteboard and says, look, we've only got X number of days left in the White House. So what do you guys want to do? You've only got this amount of time to achieve what you want to achieve. So what is that? Let's see if we can use this last 300 days or 200 days or whatever it was to achieve what we want to do. And I wonder if something similar isn't going on in the Biden White House at the moment. They realize they've lost. Harris was wiped out. Biden's legacy is going to be overturned as much as possible. And, he's out there in a certain amount of disgrace. The Democrat Party in general is licking its wounds, so they're not yet in such a great position to take on Trump as serious opposition. As you quite rightly said earlier in this episode, business and media, and certainly social media, is all swinging behind Trump. So it's a kind of an end of the era feeling about this iteration of the Democrat Party. And I wonder if they're just saying, like, look, what do we want to do? Because we don't have to deal with any of these consequences anymore. We don't have to deal with any of the fallout anymore of any of our harebrained desires, any of the stuff that we really wanted to do, but we couldn't do because the consequences would have been dire, and we had to think, now we don't. We can just do what the hell we want. Yeah, let's screw Russia. They deserve to be punished. We don't like Russia. Let's screw them. We don't care if it messes with the bond market. We don't care if it sends Europe under a bus. Who cares? We do this. This is what we want to do. We've only got this amount of time. We're out of here. Same recently with Israel. Listeners will know I take no view whatsoever on the Israel situation, but it seems as though Israel's been pressured into accepting some kind of deal. It seems like the sort of deal that they didn't want to accept until quite recently. And, it's the same with the chips, for example, that we were just talking about before. The Biden administration is doing this. It doesn't care anymore what the consequences are. It's just doing the things that it always wanted to do, but couldn't do because it knew the consequences were dire. What do you say to that, Philip Pilkington?
It's possible, but I don't think so. I really think that this is targeted at the Trump administration. I think you see it in the media reporting and everything. I think you see it in the way that they're now reporting this should cause inflation. It's like they want to cause inflation. Like that's kind of the buzz that's going around. Oh, it'll definitely cause inflation and so on. And just prima facie, I don't think anyone really believes in the sanctions anymore. I think they know that stuff like this hurts the West more than it hurts Russia, and may even generate additional revenue for Russia. The gas sanctions hurt Europe, and so in theory, the Americans can just go, I don't care. The oil sanctions always hurt America. It played a large role in the 2022-2023 inflation because, oil prices are global, and messing around with the shipping of oil globally comes back and hits the oil price in America. So, no, I really, really think this is targeted at the Trump administration.